One of my favorite descriptions of Jesus' life is that he often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Like a son who loves every minute that he can get with his dad, Jesus spent every spare moment of his life dwelling with God in lonely places. And there was perhaps no place more lonely than the Garden of Gethsemane. Late at night, with the cross just hours away, it says that Jesus became greatly troubled and sorrowful to the point of death. And though he asked his three closest friends to watch and pray with him, they all fell asleep. And so Jesus once more withdrew to a lonely place where for over an hour he prayed to God what Matthew summarizes in just these few words: "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but your will be done." The cup Jesus mentions here is about God's purpose to pour out judgment on the evil and sin of humanity in order to bring about their redemption. And by drinking this bitter cup, Jesus would take into himself and experience on our behalf the awful amalgamation of shame and suffering concocted by a sin-cursed world. And although it's for this very purpose that he came, Jesus, evidently in this moment, feels weak as the cup nears his lips to drink it. And he asks God to take it away. And according to what happens in the next chapter, his Father in heaven said no. And the question that it raises for us is, if God said no, then what was the point of Jesus' prayer? And maybe you felt the same. What's the point of prayer if God might just say no? And the point, I think, is in what Jesus says to his disciples in verse 41. "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." See, the point of prayer is not to bend God's will to mine, but to align my will with his. Prayer is not about satisfying the desires of the flesh, but solidifying God's will in our spirit. This is why Jesus wanted the disciples to pray, and this is the real point of why Jesus himself prayed in the garden, so that even when his flesh was weak with suffering, his spirit was strengthened by the power of prayer. Not my will and my weakness, but your will by thy strength. And so, in the hour of greatest need, Jesus retreated to the sacred rhythm that ought to characterize all our lives, when we surrender our will to God in private, to be strengthened to do his will in public. And God's response to that prayer is always yes.